People in Cedar Ridge County laughed about Walter Briggs for exactly 93 days before they stopped laughing altogether. It started on a Thursday afternoon in June of 1987 when a reporter from the Cedar Ridge Gazette snapped a picture of four goats standing in brush taller than a pickup truck behind Walter's property. The headline hit town the next morning before most people finished breakfast. Old farmer rejects $15,800 land clearing plan. Buys goats instead. By noon, the story had spread through every diner, feed store, gas station, and church parking lot in the county. Men laughed so hard at Ruth, Inn's diner one guy nearly choked on bacon. Somebody pinned a newspaper clipping beside the cash register at Miller's Feed and wrote this ought to go well underneath it in red marker. By Saturday night, people had started driving past Walter Briggs' property just to look at the goats. Walter was 64 years old, stubborn, widowed, and sitting on 82 acres of land most people thought was beyond saving. The back 40 had turned into a wall of wild brush over the last 4 years with honeysuckle, sumac, blackberry cane, and multiflora rows thick enough to rip your shirt open if you walked through it wrong. You couldn't even see parts of the fence line anymore. The county had already warned Walter twice about the spread creeping toward neighboring property. Earlier that spring, Cedar Ridgeland Management Director Evan Pritchard personally brought Walter a full restoration proposal with a forestry mulcher, an excavation crew, brush grinding, and root treatment for a total cost of $15,800. Evan thought the meeting was straightforward. Walter would complain about the price, wait a week, then sign the paperwork like everyone else eventually did. Instead, Walter sold his ATV and bought 4 goats. Not 20 goats. Not a professional grazing setup. For goats. That detail made the story explode. People could almost understand 50 goats. 4 sounded insane. Evan heard about it while eating lunch in his office. At first he thought somebody was exaggerating. Then he saw the newspaper clipping himself and just stared at it for a few seconds. You're telling me this man turned down a county-approved restoration plan for 4 damn goats? The secretary laughed. Whole town's talking about it. Evan shook his head slowly. That property's a disaster area. Those animals won't make a dent in it. An hour later, he drove out there himself. Walter was near the back fence, setting temporary wire, while the goats disappeared into brush almost over their heads. Evan got out of the truck, already irritated. Walter, tell me this isn't actually your plan. Walter didn't stop working. Been working so far. Evan looked around in disbelief. You've had them one day. Still working. Evan walked closer to the brush line and pointed toward the field. That growth back there is 6, 7 feet deep in places. Yep. You seriously think 4 goats can clear this? Walter finally stood up straight. No. Evan folded his arms immediately, almost relieved. Good. Walter looked him dead in the face. I think they can kill it. That paused Evan for half a second. Walter, with all due respect, this isn't some backyard patch. You need machinery. Walter shrugged. Machinery cuts the top off. That's how land clearing works. That's why the brush keeps coming back. Evan was already losing patience. You're going to spend all summer watching goats chew leaves while this place keeps getting worse. Walter pushed a fence post into the ground. Then come back in September and laugh at me again. Evan stared at him another second before climbing back into his truck. This county's going to talk about this for months, he said. Walter nodded once. County talks about everything. Evan drove away, convinced he had just witnessed a lonely old man finally slipping in his stubborn stupidity. The problem for Walter was that the story kept growing. Every day, somebody added another layer to it. By the second week, people were saying he bought the goats because he couldn't afford groceries anymore. Somebody else claimed he'd lost the property already and was pretending otherwise. The local radio station joked that Cedar Ridge now had government-certified landscaping goats. Walter heard all of it. He just never answered any of it. Every morning at 5:30, he walked the back section with a coffee thermos in one hand and a bucket of feed in the other, while he moved fencing, checked water, and watched the goats work. And the goats worked constantly. That was the first thing Walter noticed that nobody else understood. They never stopped. The billy goat especially. The animal attacked brush like it owed him money, shoving into thick canes and thorn walls until bark hung off the branches in strips. Walter started keeping notes in a small spiral notebook he carried in his shirt pocket. June 18th. West edge thinning. June 21st. Ground visible near cedar line. June 26th. First dead root clusters. By early July, something uncomfortable started happening around Cedar Ridge County. People driving past Walter's property slowed down a little longer than before, because now you could actually see patches of dirt where there hadn't been dirt in years. Not huge sections, not dramatic, but enough to make people stop joking quite so confidently. One evening, a cattle farmer named Russ Holloway drove out there after hearing rumors at the feed mill. He climbed a fence and stood there staring at a section near the western edge of the property. "No damn way," he muttered. Walter kept fixing fence wire without looking up. Russ walked deeper along the line. The brush was genuinely gone in places. Not cut down. Gone. The ground underneath looked exposed for the first time in years. Dead vines curled brown against the dirt, and the roots looked dry. Russ turned slowly toward Walter. "How long they been working this section?" 3 weeks. Russ looked back at the field again. 3 weeks. Walter nodded once. Russ stood there quiet for almost a full minute before asking the question Walter had been waiting for somebody to finally ask. "Ow!" Walter drove another post into the ground. "They don't just cut it. They keep eating it till the roots run out of fight." Russ didn't answer right away. "You tell Evan that?" Walter gave a small shrug. "Evan came here to explain things, not listen." That line traveled through town almost as fast as the original goat story. Suddenly the tone started changing. Not completely. People still laughed. But now there was hesitation mixed into it. And hesitation is dangerous once a crowd starts doubting itself. Evan heard the new rumors 2 days later and drove back out again, mostly irritated that people were suddenly acting like Walter Briggs had reinvented agriculture. But the second he stepped out of his truck, he stopped walking, because from the fence line, he could clearly see open ground stretching through part of the western section. Evan walked forward slowly. Jesus Christ! Walter didn't smile. Didn't even look at him. Evan crouched near the dirt and grabbed a dead vine. The thing felt dry and brittle, and the roots already looked weak. He stood back up and stared at the goats deeper in the field. How much of this did they clear? About 11 acres. Evan looked at him sharply. "Already?" Walter nodded. "Still got a ways to go." Evan walked another few yards into the section. The contractor estimated 2 days with a forestry mulcher. Walter finally looked at him. "Yeah." Evan stared at the field. "This took 3 weeks." "Yeah." "Then how's this better?" Walter wiped sweat from his forehead with one sleeve. "Because in 4 years this'll still be open." Evan didn't answer immediately. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Walter saw uncertainty hit him. Small, but there. Evan looked back toward the untouched sections still buried under brush. 4 goats did this." Walter nodded once. Evan looked genuinely unsettled now. Not embarrassed yet. Not humbled. Just uncomfortable in the way people get when reality starts moving against something they were sure about. "There's no way this scales across the whole property," he said finally. Walter turned back toward the fencing. "Guess we'll find out." That night at Ruth Inn's diner, the conversation sounded different. Nobody laughed as hard anymore, because now there was a possibility Walter Briggs might not be crazy after all. And people hate realizing they mocked somebody too early. Walter Briggs never bothered explaining himself to the people laughing at him because, in his mind, the decision had already been made long before he bought the goats. What nobody in Cedar Ridge County understood was that Walter wasn't guessing. He had seen this work before. Back in the early 1950s, when Walter was still a kid, his father almost lost half their pasture during a drought year after thick brush started spreading across the property. Neighbors told his father to rent machinery they couldn't afford, but instead he came home one afternoon with 6 skinny goats from a livestock auction. People laughed back then, too. Walter still remembered one neighbor asking his father how he planned to fight a forest with goats. But by the end of that summer, the pasture had opened back up enough for cattle again. Walter's father made him walk the property every evening while the goats worked, and he repeated the same lesson over and over. Machines cut what you can see. Goats kill what's underneath. Walter never forgot that. That was why he barely looked at Evan Pritchard's restoration proposal when it showed up that spring. Evan talked about machinery, excavation crews, and root treatment, but Walter had already watched neighboring properties go through the same cycle for years. The brush always came back. The county called it maintenance. Walter called it paying twice for the same problem. So instead of signing the paperwork, he spent weeks walking the property alone before making his decision. He checked where the thickest brush was spreading and which sections still had softer growth the goats could attack first. Every few nights, he wrote short notes in a small spiral notebook he carried in his pocket. Nothing complicated, just observations. Western edge still weak. Blackberry roots shallow near cedar line. Honeysuckle spreading faster after rain. By the time he bought the goats, Walter already knew exactly where he wanted to start. That was the part nobody understood. To the rest of the county, it looked like an old man making a stubborn decision because he couldn't accept modern solutions. But Walter wasn't trying to prove a point. He honestly believed the goats would solve the problem better than the machines would. That was why the jokes never really bothered him. He never argued at Ruthen's diner, never called the newspaper after the article came out, never tried defending himself when the radio station joked about landscaping goats. Because as far as Walter was concerned, the argument had already been settled 40 years earlier when he watched his father clear the same kind of brush the exact same way. Evan started realizing that sometime in mid-July, during another visit to the property, Walter was repairing temporary fencing while the goats worked deeper into the western section. Evan noticed the small notebook sticking out of Walter's shirt pocket and asked to see it. Most of the pages were filled with short observations about root strength, bark damage, and regrowth patterns. Evan flipped through a few pages, then stopped and looked at Walter. "You've been planning this since spring?" Walter shrugged once. "Brush tells you what it's going to do if you look long enough." Evan looked back down at the notebook again. "You really believe this would work the whole time?" Walter took the notebook back. "No," he said quietly. "I knew it would." Later that evening, Walter walked through one of the first sections the goats had worked. He crouched near a cluster of dead vines, grabbed one of the roots, and pulled it loose from the dirt almost effortlessly. That was the moment he finally allowed himself a smile. Because now he knew the goats weren't just clearing the brush anymore. They were killing it. The first person in Cedar Ridge County to realize Walter Briggs might actually be right was Russ Holloway, which surprised people because Russ had spent most of June making fun of the goats louder than anybody else. Then one afternoon, he drove out to Walter's property after hearing rumors that open ground was starting to show through the western section. He expected to see a few small patches. Instead, he found entire stretches of brush already gone. Not knocked down, gone. When he finally found Walter near the fence line, the first thing he asked was how long they'd been working this part. Little over 3 weeks. Russ looked back toward the field again. 3 weeks. Walter nodded once. Russ stood there quiet for a second before asking the question nobody in town had really asked yet. How the hell are they doing this? Walter shrugged. They keep eating till the roots run out of fight. Russ repeated that line at Ruth Ann's diner that same night, and by the next morning the entire county was talking again. But now the story sounded different. The jokes started getting replaced by questions. How much land had actually been cleared? How many goats did Walter buy again? Could this actually work long-term? Miller's Feed sold out of portable fencing that weekend because 2 farmers suddenly wanted to experiment a little. Even a local radio station stopped joking about landscaping goats and started calling Walter Briggs that old farmer everybody's watching now. Evan Pritchard hated how fast the story was turning. A month earlier, everybody trusted the county restoration plan. Now, people were acting like Walter had figured out something the experts missed. So Evan drove back out to the property again, expecting to calm the rumors down. Instead, the moment he stepped out of the truck, he realized the rumors had actually undersold it. Walter hadn't cleared a few patches. He had opened up huge sections of the western pasture already. Evan walked straight up to Walter. "How much of this is done?" "About 22 acres. Evan stared at him. 22? Walter nodded once. That number hit Evan harder than he expected, because now this wasn't just an old man making progress anymore. 22 acres in a little over a month meant the goats were competing with actual restoration crews. Evan tried finding a reason it wouldn't last. Soil conditions, weak roots, temporary die-off. But every section Walter showed him looked worse than the last. The brush wasn't recovering. It was dying. Evan finally looked at Walter and asked the question he never thought he'd ask. "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" Walter tightened another section of fence wire before answering. "I knew what goats do when you leave them long enough." Evan looked back across the property again, then shook his head slowly. A month earlier, he would have bet his career those goats wouldn't clear 5 acres by the end of summer. Walter Briggs had already cleared 22, and the goats were still moving forward every single day. By the middle of August, almost everybody in Cedar Ridge County had heard the number 22 acres, but most people still didn't fully believe it. They believed Walter had made progress. They just didn't believe 4 goats were actually beating the county's restoration plan. So the rumors kept splitting into 2 sides. Half the town thought Walter had stumbled into some lucky stretch of weak brush. The other half started wondering if the old man had known something all along. Walter ignored both sides and kept pushing the goats deeper into the northern section of the property, which was exactly where everybody expected the whole thing to fail. That part of the land had been untouched for years. Thick cedar growth, old root systems, brush packed so tightly together that one contractor had called it machine territory only back in spring. Even people starting to believe in Walter still said the same thing. Those goats ain't getting through the north side. That was the pressure hanging over the whole story now. If the goats stalled there, everybody who laughed at Walter would immediately feel justified again. And Walter knew it. One Friday morning, Evan Pritchard drove out with 2 county officials and a restoration contractor named Bill Turner, the same man who originally estimated nearly $16,000 to clear the property. Bill stepped out of the truck, already shaking his head. "I still don't buy this," he muttered while looking toward the northern section. "Goats don't clear root-heavy brush this thick." Walter heard him, but kept tightening fence wire without responding. Evan noticed that. Walter never argued anymore. He just let people keep talking until the land answered for him. The group walked deeper into the property while the goats worked farther up the hill. Bill stopped after about 50 yards and looked around slowly. "Hold on," he said. "This whole section was closed up." Evan nodded. "Back in June, yeah." Bill stared another few seconds. "No machines been through here?" "No." Bill crouched down near a dead cluster of multiflora rose and grabbed one of the roots. The thing pulled loose almost immediately. He looked genuinely confused now. "That's not supposed to happen this fast." Walter finally spoke. "Roots gave up." Bill stood back up. "No, roots don't just—" Then he stopped himself halfway through the sentence because everywhere he looked, the evidence was sitting right in front of him. Dead brush. Open ground. No regrot. The goats kept moving through another thick section farther ahead while the men stood there watching. One of the county officials looked over at Evan. "How much has he cleared now?" Evan answered quietly. "Little over 50 acres. Bill turned around immediately. 50. Evan nodded once. Nobody spoke for a second after that, because 50 acres stopped sounding like luck. 50 acres sounded like proof. Then Bill looked farther up the northern section and frowned. "Wait, they're already in there." That was the part nobody expected. The goats had already started opening sections of the north side that everyone said would stop them completely. Bill walked uphill faster now, almost angry about what he was seeing. The farther he went, the quieter he got. Finally, he stopped near an old cedar line and just stared. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "We estimated 3 machines minimum for this area." Walter stayed near the fence line while the others kept looking around. Evan watched Bill carefully because this was the same contractor who laughed hardest back in June. Bill had told people at Ruthin's Diner that Walter was feeding goats to a forest. Now, he looked like a man trying to explain something that no longer made sense to him. One of the county officials finally asked the question everybody there was thinking. "How much money's he spent on this whole thing?" Walter answered without looking up. "Less than $1,000. Bill let out a short laugh under his breath, but there wasn't any humor in it anymore. Evan looked back across the property again, then toward the goats still tearing through the northern section one mouthful at a time. 3 months earlier, he had publicly dismissed the entire idea. He remembered standing in Walter's driveway talking about machinery, efficiency, professional restoration plans. Now he was standing in the middle of over 50 cleared acres, trying to explain why an old farmer with 4 goats had outperformed the county estimate. Evan finally looked directly at Walter. "You knew this would happen from the start, didn't you?" Walter shrugged once. "Told you to come back in September." A couple of the men laughed quietly at that. Evan didn't. He kept staring at the field for another few seconds before speaking again, this time loud enough for everybody standing there to hear him clearly. "I was wrong." Nobody said anything after that. Even the goats were the only thing making noise for a moment. Bill Turner looked over at Evan like he couldn't believe he'd actually said it out loud. But Evan kept going. "Truth is, we all missed this." Then he looked back at Walter. "You understood this land better than we did." Walter nodded, once like none of this surprised him anymore. And standing there in the middle of 63 cleared acres, with county officials, contractors, and half the local farming community watching the goats tear through brush everyone said they'd never beat, nobody in Cedar Ridge County was laughing anymore. By the first week of October, nobody in Cedar Ridge County was laughing anymore. Walter Briggs had cleared almost the entire property. More than 78 acres of heavy brush had either been stripped down or completely killed off, including the northern section everybody said the goats would never get through. The county's original estimate had been nearly $16,000 with multiple machinery crews. Walter had done it with 4 goats, portable fencing, and less than $1,000 total. That number spread through town faster than anything else in the story. Less than $1,000. Farmers who mocked Walter all summer started driving out to his property, asking questions instead. What kind of goats did he buy? How often did he move the fencing? How long did he leave them on one section? Walter answered every question the same way he handled everything else that summer. Calm. Simple. No bragging. One Saturday morning, nearly a dozen local farmers showed up at Walter's property after hearing he was working the last section near the North Ridge. Instead of laughing at the goats, they stood there taking notes while Walter explained how repeated grazing weakened the roots over time. One man asked him why the brush wasn't growing back after rainstorms. Walter pointed toward the dead sections behind them. "Because machines cut the top," he said. "Goats keep pressure on it till the roots quit." Another farmer asked how he learned all this. Walter shrugged once. "My father knew it before I did." Even Evan Pritchard started sending people out to Walter's property. By November, the Cedar Ridge Land Management Office officially added targeted goat grazing into its restoration recommendations for overgrown land. Evan personally invited Walter to speak at a county agriculture meeting, and for the first time all year, the same people who laughed at him sat quietly listening while he explained how to rotate grazing sections and identify weak root zones. At one point during the meeting, somebody asked Evan if the county would still recommend expensive machinery first. Evan looked over at Walter before answering. "Not before we ask whether goats can solve it better." That line stayed with people. So did the fact that Evan publicly admitted something almost nobody expected from him back in June. Walter Briggs understood this land better than we did. By winter, at least 7 farmers around Cedar Ridge had bought goats of their own. Miller's Feed started stocking portable fencing year-round because demand suddenly exploded after Walter's success. The local paper even ran one final headline before Christmas. The goats were right. But the part people remembered most wasn't the articles or the meetings. It was Walter himself. Because after all the attention, all the apologies, and all the recognition, he never really changed. Every morning, he still woke up before sunrise, poured coffee into the same old thermos, and walked the property checking fence lines while the goats worked nearby. No victory speeches. No, I told you so. One afternoon, Daniel Briggs stood beside his father, looking across the open pasture that had been buried under brush earlier that year. "Feels different out here now," he said quietly. Walter nodded once. "Land can breathe again." Daniel looked at him for a moment before speaking again. "You knew this would work the whole time, didn't you?" Walter looked across the field where the goats were feeding near the old cedar line. "Most things worth knowing," he said, "ain't written down anywhere." You learn him by paying attention longer than other people are willing to. Then he picked up his fencing tools and went back to work while the goats kept moving slowly across the pasture, doing exactly what they had done from the beginning.